Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast about video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. This week we're back to Dark Souls 3, and joining us for the conversation is once again friend of the pod, writer, and co-host of Real Rap, Shane. We talk about what makes Dark Souls 3 stand out for better and worse, including playerly progression, moments of silence, and the tropical melancholy of the final area of the DLC. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Today, we're happy to be joined once again by a friend of the pod, Shane, to talk about Dark Souls 3, which we talked about recently. I just recently have been playing again for the first time, basically since it came out. But Shane, why don't you say a little bit about your experience with the game and kind of where you're at with it right now?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Love the podcast. I've been playing Dark Souls for the past probably month and a half. Um, and I first came upon the game. I think I told this on the last time that I came, but my first encounter with anything related to Dark Souls was I had a friend who had a fraternal twin brother who we were getting drunk with, and he in basically a blacked out state kept saying, I just want to play Dark Souls. I just want to play Dark Souls. And this was right when Dark Souls 3 had come out. And I was like, I don't know what that is, like what you're talking about. And then he like turned it on and drunkenly started playing it. I remember watching being like, fuck is this game? Is this like a Japanese thing? Is this like Persona or something? Like it didn't really make sense looking at it. And then I think I went home and maybe like 6 months later was like, all right, maybe I'll pick it up. And then I think I was like, yeah, absolutely not. This sucks. I had like had it for a little bit of time. Maybe I rented it somehow when that was still possible. And then maybe a few years after that, I picked it up and it was the first Souls game I played at all. And then this is my first time revisiting it after I beat that the first time, then I think I played Sekiro and one and a little Bloodborne and I never played two. And then when Elden Ring came out, I played that. And then I played some Souls 3 DLC back in the day as well, which was kind of coming back to me as I was playing this time.
Yeah, I remember the story because I think it was the first time you actually came on our podcast. And I was wondering like how far did you get in that first playthrough? But I guess I take it that
Yeah.
you did make it all the way to the end, which is
Um,
not the case for people's first Souls games, right? Like often it's like you hit a wall and you stop playing and maybe you pick up one later, you never pick them up again.
Yeah, I definitely didn't play it through the first time I played, and I realized why when I was playing it this time. That first section when you're just going through like the training area, and then you get to the first boss. I remember just being like, this sucks. Like this is like really hard. I clearly I don't have the manual and everybody, somehow knows exactly what to do here. And I found myself really frustrated playing this time. Like it was fine beating the first boss. I could not figure out that I had to light the first flame in order to progress at all. So I'm just marching around and I tested myself like how long is it going to take me to get to the first like path of this game, and it was like 20 minutes of just like going to the walls, like going downstairs in the Firelink shrine, trying to talk to everybody, and then I was like, oh, I think it has to be something with like this area because you can kind of see like the developer pathing you in a way.
It's funny because you mentioned the development pathing, but I don't think I mean, of course, we've talked about Shane with you, like I think in multiple cases, like how FromSoft and Souls developers in general, like break a lot of norms of video game pathing, and require you or expect you to just sort of figure out completely counterintuitive sort of leaps of spatial logic or just logic in general, like do this thing, do this gesture. I mean, sometimes these are for side content, but like do this particular gesture in this particular location and something will happen. But even for like advancing along the main quest in Souls games, that can be quite challenging. And so um this makes me realize it's a very basic point, but it's one that I don't think we've quite articulated on this podcast and in these conversations, which is that the difficulty is not just that the correct path can be counterintuitive. and is totally unthematized or unannounced. There's no like map marker or whatever objective marker. But also because the correct answers are often so idiosyncratic, it breeds a kind of like anxiety or paranoia where it's like, well, literally anything could be the path forward. So it's not like I can't winnow it down and say, okay, let me try going this way and let me try going this way. It's
Yeah.
like I could have to hit on a wall. I could have to press X somewhere where that's not obvious that you are supposed to press interact. Um, I could have to talk to an NPC. Um, it literally can feel sometimes like the possibilities are infinite because progression in these games is not sort of edited down to what might, it's just sort of like a lizard brain capability or caveman capability. And I don't say that as like to like sort of like, um I don't know, consecrate the Souls games. Like that's not necessarily a positive feature. It's just a feature, it's like how they operate. It can be incredibly frustrating at times too.
Yeah, I want to just say I deeply identify with the guy who gets drunk and really wants to play Dark Souls. We've talked before, Nathan, with about Souls games being like cozy games, and I feel like that kind of lends itself to that sort of blind playing, as it were, or whatever, right? But I also, this is making me think because I think we touched on this a little bit last time we talked about Dark Souls 3, which is that comparatively with Dark Souls 1 at least, because that's the one that I have the clearest kind of image in my mind, there's way less, I think, of that anxiety about where to go, but there's like a kind of inverse anxiety about it because you expect there to be this anxiety about where to go. Like in Dark Souls 3, not everything is connected to everything else the way that it is in Dark Souls 1, albeit there are, you can, of course, teleport, right? And I think that kind of is the reason for that. Like there aren't as many twisting paths, for example. You don't, go from the Valley of the Drakes to Blight Town and then to the depths or whatever, right? There's not that same interconnectivity through actual terrain, which just makes me think about how, at the core of Dark Souls, that is something that's kind of amazing about it, but it's amazing precisely because it's so frustrating. Like in Dark Souls, you can go down into the skeletons and just get killed from the beginning of your game, or you can correctly go to Undead Burg and get through that area. But there's nothing telling you where to go. There's nothing telling you where to go in Dark Souls 3, but if you explore enough, it becomes pretty clear, I think, like where to go next because you can't go everywhere, right away. Um, so I don't know, I'm still kind of, I'm almost done, I think, with the DLC, and then we'll be done with the game, I guess, in this playthrough. And I've been really enjoying it, but I still have this sense of that there's a kind of tiredness to the game or that there's something, we talked last time about how there's even a moment that feels like super hand-holdy in a cutscene where you like light some fire. I forget if you light it or extinguish it, but either way, it like pans the camera to this castle in the distance in a way that Dark Souls 1 never would. It's like, oh, well, it's almost like a Disney movie or something. Like, here's where you're gonna go once you do this little task or whatever. Um, and I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of associating here, free associating. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but it's been on my mind still.
Brian, we talked about Dark Souls 3 last time. We talked about the kind of the hand-holding nature of it, the fan servicey nature of it.
Mhm.
I don't remember honestly now, but I don't think we talked about the aspect of the game that directly contradicts what I just said, which is that Dark Souls 3 does seem to be a game that knows about other video games. Like it's a game that actually exists less in a vacuum of its own, like where there are times where I'm like, this is only like 1 degree removed from God of War, you know? Partly because I think it's just like fun as hell. It's an incredibly well made, like exquisitely well made game and a really, really fun game. But from like the spectacle that we talked about last time, again the fan servicey nature of some of the characters and locations, but also, yeah, this way in which I would say there's not just again, totally in contradistinction to what I just said, about the series as a whole, like there's not that same um just obscurity about where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. Like there's a pretty propulsive path forward where you will probably just in spite of yourself end up progressing along, from one environment to the next. But it's also that I want to say like Dark Souls 3 has a much more conventional like uh progression, like where there aren't these weird lulls or weird dips or like hooks backward or just like weird silences. And I have a question about silence too that we can come back to, but the shape of the game, and Shane, I'm not sure how far you've gotten on this particular play, but I feel like just like the shape of the game more resembles a linear blockbuster game more than any other Dark Souls game. I mean, especially maybe Dark Souls 2, which has a weird this could be a function also of just how meaty the DLC is, but Dark Souls 2 like feels like it never really reaches any heights of intensity. It never reaches any kind of spectacle. And in fact, the ending is like, or the quote unquote final boss, the King Vendrick who you're supposed to be finding for, not the actual final boss, but the nominal final boss is a very pointed deflation. Like you find him and he's just walking around in a circle with his like brain rotted and won't even attack you. Um, and so Dark Souls 3 has this kind of mellowness that is pretty homogeneous for its entirety, and it just goes on forever. So it just feels like you're hitting the same note for at a point where it actually becomes distinct. Like it becomes palpable, like how monotonous the whole thing is and how sort of monotone. Whereas Dark Souls 3, it's like a pretty strong crescendo, like the bosses get bigger and more bombastic, the locations get more epic, you know, um, and and there's very little time spent. I mean, maybe I'll just raise the silence. Sorry, I'm talking for a while, but maybe I'll just raise the silence question now. Like, I would say there's very little time spent like reflecting, ruminating, or just sort of pacing about in confusion. To the point where I want to maybe pose this question to both of you. Uh, we've talked a lot in praise of this series, about the silence, the sort of particular silence of Dark Souls. And I wonder, like, is Dark Souls 3 a silent game? And that doesn't need to be purely about its audio design, but in temperament, in disposition, in atmosphere. Like, does it have silence in the way that the other Dark Souls games do?
When I think of I'm right now at Anor Londo, and I'm trying to beat that uh dilapidated witch something with the purple sword. And um I'm finding at this point in the game, I was really struggling to find the handle that pulls the swirly elevator down. And I was looking at a map online. It was showing me exactly where it was, and I'm like, where is this thing? And I was really just finding myself at this point. I'm trying to get through as much as I can for the podcast, and maybe playing it a little differently. But I do find I get to a point in most of the games towards like the last three quarters where, and I don't even know if that's really where I am. I could be. I'll look up things and people are like, "Oh yeah, you're still early in the game." I've been playing for like 44 hours. Um, but I've been finding like this silence starts to come when I'm doing like run-ups to bosses or when I completely understand where I'm supposed to go and I'm like just like doe-eyed running past the Dragon Slayer archers and I know exactly what like nothing is surprising and none of the interactions with the enemies mean anything when I'm like I'll run past you, I'll run past you and I'm purely just having this like internal experience of like um, okay, I kind of understand how the level's designed. I need to get to the boss fight so I can just kind of like keep pressing the boss fight. I have no interest in the in between. And so it's almost funny when you'll have those intermediate kind of like invasions or like characters that look like they're an invasion where you have to fight them like in the middle of the map and it's like buddy, like whatever ring you have, like this is totally meaningless. So like that's where the game gets kind of silent and like responseless to me when I've just seen it so many times, or I am so disinterested in this at this point in things that aren't the bosses, and like fighting the pyromancers or something to get to where I need to go because I know when I'm at the boss area, I'll be able to run a short distance from the flame to the boss, and I need to like establish that short distance so I can just keep trying it. And as time goes on, you start to see that a little more clearly of just like, okay, the design is like they'll send you on like a long walk to get to the second flame of an area or the third, and then you'll have a short walk to get to the boss. And so I find myself now just like I gotta push past that first area. And even in my first run through, I'm not really looking around. I'll just run as far as I can. And I've been using a sorcery to make myself invisible. So that's okay. This is actually interesting because I did my first invasion and it was my first real experience of like silence and emptiness in the game. I was in the swamp where the crabs are and the castle. Sorry, I don't know the names. Um, and I invaded for some reason. I guess on the Steam Deck it was set to online and I kept invading people by accident and I was like, God, I hate this game. And I would go into the same area that I was, with the crabs, but I was invading, so nothing interacted with me. And I was watching giant crabs walk by, and these guys I had so much trouble with like the logs in their hands, just do nothing, just stand around. And I was like, this kind of blows the whole game up. Like you send me into an invasion, and suddenly like now I'm just walking around the environment, and it like sucks, and like it's just people milling around like it's a mall or something. Like everything about the like when the interactivity left, like when you become invisible, it kind of leaves, but not totally. But when you invade, you're totally not part of the game, and it just dies like instantly. And then you're fighting another character, and the way they move, I don't want to interact with me. Like I don't want to interact with another player. I don't care what leveling they've done. And like I'm sure they have like 30 potions now, so I just don't want to I don't want to encounter myself or anybody even close to myself in this world. I only want to be interacting with like the setup, the design, the way they want me to play it. I don't want like invasions or extra people or the interactions with other people in the game I find so cheap. Placing the name cards down. I know you guys don't really play with the signs on the ground, but I just did that. It like was on when I started playing, so I was reading them and they're fun to read, but it's almost as if the developers will just like, hey, we got to put like band-aids on so many things. We'll just have the community like put down signs of like illusory wall. And to just go deeper on this tangent, annoyed by how many illusory walls there are. It wasn't that supposed to be a novelty. Like there's like three, but now it's like no, that's like a core function of the game. And in order to like finish, you kind of have to hit like three essential ones. Um, it made me angry.
At one point, there's three in a row in the DLC. There's actually three in a row, and they're all you just have to keep hitting the next wall, and it's rather stupid. But I have like a bunch of I think maybe we need to distinguish different types of silence because we keep talking about silence in all of the From Software games, I think, and we mean something different each time.
Mhm.
I like Shane that you just mentioned this kind of pocket of silence you found in the swamp with the crabs or whatever, because it makes me think of actually, I'm gonna read the last lines of this book, The Lathe of Heaven by Le Guin, but it's not any kind of spoiler because it's just kind of a poetic ending. But the alien watched them from within the glass-fronted shop as a sea creature might watch from an aquarium, seeing them pass and disappear into the mist. I feel like that's kind of like the experience of being in the world where you can't interact with anything and you're kind of like, not only because it's in a swamp, but there's this kind of aquatic, feeling to the silence or whatever. It's like it's more like muffled or something like that almost, which is how I would think about, Nathan and I didn't start playing these games online until kind of recently, right? I think that's the case with you too, Nathan. So, um, for years, for like the whole time I had ever played these games, only once or twice had I ever had like, free Xbox Live is free for the weekend automatically, and then I would play online, I guess, but now it's always online because I have the subscription for PS5, and so there is a weird sense in which there's a new element introduced that kind of feels like maybe in comparison to playing offline, there's a kind of different weight to it, or there's almost like a muffled quality. But I'm thinking about how, like in Dark Souls 1, which for me will always be the primordial experience of silence, I think, in a game. Just because of how big of a revelation that was when I first played it. Like I never knew that a game like that could exist, and at the same time, it was the sort of thing I was looking for. So it was like I had imagined something like this, didn't know it would ever happen, and finally, like it came out, and I played it, and I was like, wow, I wouldn't have said this at the time, but this is silent in the way that I have kind of fantasized about. Um, I'm still not sure. I think that's the hardest kind of silence to articulate. Like there is a big silence to that game, but Dark Souls 3 has this maybe like epic or narrative silence. Like, the video, I'm gonna forget what is it? Dark Souls 3 is thinking of ending things. This video that maybe we can link because I thought it was a pretty interesting video. I think is making kind of a point about silence when it's discussing the end of the game, but that's like the only time that like there's like a narrative silence that seems to be the point of the culmination of the game. But I think I'd kind of agree that like the silence that you actually experience in the game, not in a cutscene, not in a theoretical or reflective sense, but just like through the actual experience of playing, is in like the flow state of repetition when you have a task or something like that. Whereas, Nathan, we've talked about silence in Elden Ring before, and that kind of silence is like a blanket of silence, right? Like there's the sky that has these curtains in it and stuff, and then there's a sense in which, you have so much epic stuff going on, but there's almost like a switch or a dialectic where sometimes you don't think about that at all, and there's instead a kind of silence where you're going from place to place, and you might be killing stuff, you might just be existing in the world. And maybe because there's this nice kind of ambient string music playing, there's a kind of silence that suffuses it that almost removes any narrative at all from whatever you're doing. Even at the same time as the narrative is so overdetermined as to be ridiculous, right? We've thought about this a little bit before. Everyone has the same name, that everyone turns into somebody else or whatever, right? There's all this kind of crisscrossing lore that goes on, and yet underneath all that or existing alongside of it, there's a kind of silence. But yeah, I think in I don't know, I would say that Dark Souls 3 only has this kind of incidental silence through Shane, as you said, like the repetition. Like there's a like I was grinding a bunch on the staircase that leads up to the two princes, and trying to just that's like I think one of the best places if you have to level up. And there was a sort of silence that would happen there, because it's like a pretty difficult, you can easily get killed on the way up there, but if you just kind of are not really thinking about anything and you're not treating that area like a run up to a boss, but instead just like an area where you can put in a certain amount of time and then you can go mathematically get one more level or something like that. Afterwards, it becomes silent. But otherwise, the game feels kind of loud because it's putting us on this one track to progress until the next boss or whatever it might be.
Yeah, Shane, your example makes me think of I want to say, and this may be putting words in your mouth or distorting your point, but I want to say it's like if Dark Souls 3 is silent in such moments, it's silent in the way that like an Ubisoft game is silent, i.e., it's like the silence of total insignificance, where like you're seeing things happen on your screen, but none of them are meaningful, and that's how like an Assassin's Creed game, which is a series that I've somehow logged hundreds of hours in despite never liking it, Um, like the games they're full of these worlds and they're like the graphics are really good and there's a million things to do and there's a million icons on the map and yet none of it has any meaning whatsoever and or nor like differentiation, it's like a quest is not that different from like an outpost. They're all the same damn thing, fighting the same like three enemies, using the same assets, despite how beautiful it all looks. It's like the worlds are so algorithmically regurgitated, that it just feels space is completely might as well be featureless, even though there are rivers and mountains and things. It's just like it's like you're navigating a completely abstract space of nothing. And the kind of like the critical adage in a way, or some, like I've heard many critics and players even say this, is that, in such cases, the open world map is really just like a menu screen. It's like you're traversing it, but you're really just going from node to node of interaction, and that interaction is incredibly also like rudimentary and insignificant, such that an Assassin's Creed game is the quintessential podcast game, which basically means it is a silent game, right? Because you're playing it without volume. You're filling the bad silence with some other kind of noise. Um, Whereas the silence that I really love in Dark Souls, or Bloodborne, or even Elden Ring, is this is sort of like cheaply philosophical, maybe, but it's a kind of like rumination, a feeling of rumination or a space for rumination. It comes from partly the lack of like ambient music, which Dark Souls 3 also has. But I also want to say like a kind of just like uh studied understimulation, you know? So like the enemies are very non-reactive and inert, and the environments are very inert, and the soundtrack is inert, and like this, you're kind of you just hear your little tap, tap, tap of your avatar's feet, or like splash, splash, splash as you're like walking in like that sh weird shallow water that's everywhere in Souls games. And that auditory silence creates this kind of like more atmospheric or like philosophical or whatever mental silence where you're just like kind of like inhabiting or dwelling. You're not having thoughts, but you're sort of like it opens the space where maybe it's like you don't have thoughts, but you feel the lack of thoughts as an atmosphere. Does that sound like it's like, you're not having thoughts, but you register that as a positive value? Like you feel that lack of thought. And that's, I guess, maybe what I mean by rumination. It's not like I'm talking in like fortune cookie like riddles right now, but that's sort of how I feel. Um, and I just don't think Dark Souls 3 is a ruminative game, like at all. Like there's just no space for it. And I think maybe part of that is because it's not understimulating. Like there are a few locations that suck, like there's like the woods or whatever and the swamp, but in a way those are like very ugly, boring locations. But for the most part, like uh and maybe we can unpack this because I'm not sure I can even put a name to it or specify why this is, but I just feel like Dark Souls 3 has that kind of like Las Vegas vibe of like it's attention grabbing. It's there's like might as well be giant neon signs in Dark Souls 3, right? Like even if they're as simple as being like castle level, lava level, like like they just have this like it just feels like I'm playing Crash Bandicoot or something. Like it really does. Um
Hey,
and I
easy.
love hey, I mean look, I love Crash Bandicoot. I think it's better than Mario. I'll go on record. I've been on record.
Holy, okay, chill,
Uh,
chill.
but it's just it's a completely different vibe, and it's a vibe that I find. I mean, that's just really unusual to me. It's very dissonant when it comes to a Souls game. But I've said all of this, and I still couldn't tell you exactly why I don't feel like Dark Souls 3, like why I feel like that's the vibe I get from Dark Souls 3. So maybe Brian can help.
Well, I mean, not to be, the resident Kantian always, but the feeling of like just the pure empty form of a thought is what Kant says is the beautiful, right? It's like so maybe there's a weird way in which like what we're calling atmosphere is also a sustained kind of aesthetic experience where, what happens in the beautiful is like two parts of the mind that usually relate in a really specific way, relating in that way, but without any concept and without any end, right? So it's like when you think you're supposed to be like figuring something out or like fitting a perception to a concept or whatever, And you're not doing that in The Beautiful, or you're not doing that in Aesthetic Judgment. Instead, there's the sense of that, but it's without the content, right? Like there's a contentlessness to it. And so that's why that emptiness becomes, I think, like positive, right? I think when we have, and it's positive because in relation to the way that we're always like fitting things to concepts all the time, it's refreshing and surprising and feels kind of rare. And so if Dark Souls 3 is this kind of blockbuster thing where there's not as much uncertainty about where to go. Even lore-wise, I think like the lore is weird, but it's kind of easier to follow. Like I think it's still possible to play Dark Souls 1 and not know what's going on. But with Dark Souls 3, there's like it feels like there's more dialogue, more NPCs. Where the NPCs are and where they go makes more sense, I think, than in Dark Souls 3. So it's again sticking in the Kantian framework. There's more concept and there's more like of an end to it. There's more of a purpose for everything, and it feels a lot more, the dots feel a lot more connected and it feels less abstract. So I wonder if that's one way of putting it.
You both have me thinking a lot, just listening to you talk about silence in the game. And Brian, you were talking about the end, how it's almost like a imposed silence on the game, where it's like, oh, it's all gone, and whoa, everything's
Yeah.
disappeared. It's all dust.
Zooming
Don't you
out
feel
silence.
crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Dark Souls 1 could produce that feeling of emptiness in within the playing throughout.
Yeah.
And it almost feels they have to glue it on afterwards in Dark Souls 3, that it's like a decision to be made. And it's like, we are going to be the developer is going to design that feeling to come at the end, and you're going to feel it at this time or something. Whereas I think in Dark Souls 1, like you guys have been saying, there'd be times where you're walking and you start to think about like, what am I, what am I supposed to be feeling? Or like, am I supposed to now be questioning like what I'm doing? Like, why am I killing everybody? If I can just run past them, like, what is my behavior doing here? But a lot of like, now I'm thinking of silence as like, you know, death, where let's say you have like a person die in your life, you have to go from a mode of like, I was able to interact with an internal part of this person, and then when they die, there's no interaction back at me. So the silence is that now I have to live with this person, or the way that I interact with them is without an internal world or without a reaction from them. And this makes me think of Assassin's Creed or Ubisoft games where you are interacting a lot with like business decisions. Like, okay, it has to be sort of vaguely 1776 in this game. So we're gonna have like quills, and there's gonna be like woods, and it's gonna be kind of America. So like you'll be in the woods, but it's like kind of informed by this business decision of like, it has to relate to America because this game has to appear in a certain way. It's like the way that so I feel this way with AI, that there's no like internal mechanism that's like to be referenced. So if, let's say you make a discovery in AI, you're just like, it's like interacting with a dead person. Like there's no internal thing there. This is just purely business decision, things that make money. So there's no like artistic design in their creation. And like, you wouldn't go to Disney World to have an artistic experience. And if you did, it would be because you've totally sold yourself over to the Disney World experience. Bear with me. Like that, because it's all business decision and all like, you have to have the feelings that we've designed for you to have. There's nothing deeper for you to have. There's no silent moment where you're like, well, maybe I'm having actually a really unique experience of Disney World, and like, has anybody ever looked at it this way? It's like, yes, because they don't have there's no like corners of Disney World where it's like, whoa, has anyone ever found this? Or like, you're just interacting with the same things everybody else has. You can, of course, have the David Foster Wallace going on a cruise ship experience where it's like, oh, I took my artistic eye and cast the whole thing in a new light, but it's still the same thing. Where Dark Souls 1 leaves that like morass of kind of like, it to me it feels like they want you to be the world doesn't um like ha the world is only created to house the ideas of the creator in Dark Souls 1. And so when I'm having a weird interaction with like a corner of the world or something, or there's like nowhere to be or something, it feels almost like, I'm having like a unique, like they didn't maybe think about how this corner would kind of interact or how it could be used as a path or something. Like maybe it's just empty for kind of no reason. Whereas they'd never felt in Dark Souls 3 like I was in a place where I wasn't supposed to be or that I've like strayed. And when I get abandoned, like I'm a sorcerer build, and when it feels like the bosses aren't like fighting in the right way, or it feels as though the people who have the business decisions behind it, or like the the creator behind it didn't account for my experience, and instead of it opening up a new experience, it just feels like I'm kind of left behind. And all this design of the world, all this sort of aesthetic, like crunchiness and like little sepulchers and balustrades and all this bullshit design in the game, it feels like all that time was spent doing that and not crafting the like holistic player experience. And that's when I just feel like, okay, this world is totally empty.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Brian, just to jump in quickly, your last point about the art design and really the like kind of exquisite detail that's present, superficial detail that's present in Dark Souls 3 that's totally new for the series. So, upgrade the engine to the PS4 level. I think it was an adapted form of the Bloodborne engine, if I'm not mistaken. It's just like the environments are so much more detailed, and they're also full of more effects. And I think on a crude literal level, like that's part of what's going on here for me is that like like maybe you could boil this down to the enemies are just more sparkly. The enemies in Dark Souls 3, like they make like noises, like they scream at you and they like light up fiery swords and there's like particle effects and there's transformation, morphing effects. Like there's those bird things that like stab themselves and they start transforming and then they're like the enemies that turn into those giant pus, smoke monsters. Like things are constantly transforming and screaming and exploding and turning on their like sparkle swords, and shooting lasers. Like, so it does feel like everyone's putting on a show for you, and the game is putting on a show for you in a way that the other ones never did. Like, they seemed allergic to that sort of thing. And I want to again be clear, like, I like this about Dark Souls 3. Like, I think it kind of kicks ass. It goes down so easily. It's all very beautiful and very fun, but it's just a different vibe. Um, but to go back to what you were saying before, Shane, like, I love this idea that to again sort of adapt to what you were saying, what's distinctive about the headspace of a Souls game is not that you feel reflective. It's not that the game is telling you thou shalt be reflective because that's what, a game like Shadow of the Colossus will do. Like these games that are roundly praised for being serious, for being like philosophical or whatever, because they're like, you should be contemplative now. You should be think about what you just did, like, don't you feel guilty? Don't you feel mournful? Don't you feel sort of overwhelmed by the beauty of this vast world that you're despoiling or whatever? Or like in like The Last of Us, it's like don't you feel guilty right now? Like don't you feel um think, again, like yeah, like think on your actions. And I would say, yeah, or rather, like I feel like I take you to be saying like when you're playing Dark Souls, you don't feel reflective. You feel reflective about what you should be feeling. You're like, what
Mm.
is the intended response to this? You know? And that is a very unique reflexive rather than reflective state to be in, Um, and I maybe that's what I don't feel in Dark Souls 3. And actually maybe one example, a sort of simple example can encapsulate this. In Dark Souls, like if you look at the last boss of the three games, and if you want to include Bloodborne in there or Demon Souls as well, like I want to say that um if we're looking at not the optional boss, but like the official last boss that you need to beat the game, you know, it occurs to me now that the overwhelming feeling of these bosses is what the fuck? Like, I don't know who this person is. Why am I fighting this thing right now? Like, think of like Murgo's wet nurse in Dark Souls 3. It's a completely random entity that has never been mentioned a single time in the game. Um, and you're just
Bloodborne, you mean, right?
yeah,
Murgo
yeah, in
Bloodborne.
Bloodborne, sorry.
Yeah.
Um, Dark Souls 1, meanwhile, the what the fuck aspect is more about vibe. Like you finally get to Gwyn, so that makes sense. Like, okay, Gwyn, final boss, we've had lots, this has all been building up to this, and the music is like really sad or whatever, or mournful. And it's like, why is the vibe so sad? You know, this isn't Shadow of the Colossus. It's not telling me be sad. It's kind of like an unknown signifier or something. It's like, what is the emotional content of this? Dark Souls 2, you get to the king who you think the kind of Gwyn equivalent, and he's has dementia and doesn't want to attack you. And then you fight the queen, and you're like, that comes out for if you're again, if you're not like following the lore, totally out of left field. Like the final boss is Queen Nashandra, and you're just like, who's this person? You know, like why am I fighting her? I thought she was like a friend or it's just like it's just she just enters in the she just comes out of nowhere and then the game ends. Whereas in Dark Souls 3 the final boss is the Lord of Cinder, who is just a random, first of all, a pretty uninspired final boss, I think. Just a kind of random fiery, it's like it's literally like John Dark Soul to like, is that how you use the meme? It's just like fiery guy with a sword, and it's like it's actually meant to be anonymous, I think, lore-wise, because it's supposed to be like the embodiment of all the Dark Souls players, which is itself pretty lame. Like, it's like I mean, it's the ultimate fan service in that you essentially fight the fandom at the end. But then the final phase of that is Gwyn. Like you fight Gwyn again, and the music comes back, which is totally incongruous with the pattern because that's the game telling you you should feel reflective. Like, remember Dark Souls 1? Like, remember Gwyn? Like this is that, like, however you felt then is how you should feel now, or you should feel like, nostalgic or feel like we've come so far since then and now we end at the beginning or whatever. It actually, I'm kind of working myself up into this, but it actually feels like the most coercive instance of emotional dictation, that these games have anywhere. Um, and that's something that like again, like a Western AAA studio would do, in a game that I might love, but doesn't feel like Dark Souls. And I think that moment when Gwyn's theme comes back doesn't feel like Dark Souls at all.
Well, I think like to kind of to circle, I guess, back to what both of you guys have said, I think this is also a question about weirdness, right? I mean, like obviously, Nathan, you mentioned Bloodborne. We talk about Bloodborne all the time. Bloodborne, of course, is Lovecraftian, but it's also weird, right? In like a broader sense too. There is like a system of weirdness about Bloodborne where even, in the very mechanism of what, to see more about the world means like risking your sanity or whatever, right? In a way that it's kind of inaccessible as a player because the madness, whatever we've thought about this together a little bit, but the madness mechanic is so strange in that game where it risks being illegible, right? Or like winding up in the way that uh, a Lovecraft story might wind up with like a fragment of writing by somebody who went mad that just becomes totally incongruous. But I don't know, it's making me think that, pointing back even before Bloodborne, Dark Souls 1 was weird. Like it's weird in the sense that there's no if there is like kind of a narrative or even a meta language to buy into, you're not really able to buy into it because there's no frame of reference. Like I always think about Sen's Fortress when I think about Dark Souls 1. That's maybe Sen's Fortress and Orlando are like the two places where I think about how like how not for you they are. Like even though the game, like Shane, you were talking about like the game being or the question of the game being designed for the player or with the player in mind, there is definitely like a not for you-ness about some of those places too, right? And narratively, why does this fortress exist, right? Why are these big stone things with no faces that I find really terrifying that like can zap you with lightning just slowly hobbling around on the bottom of this fortress like as if they're, you know, guards or something, Like what are they doing there, Um and of course there's a sense in which the game is about like being doomed in a way, right? Like you're just doomed to you pick up the game and even the very choice to link the fire or to let it go out is like a kind of impossible choice because linking the fire just means that you're dooming humanity again to keep doing the same thing over and over again. whereas letting the fire go out is the age of darkness, but you're finally able to just kind of like let go of that cycle or something, right? So there's no good outcome, there's no good decision. There is like an inherent weirdness in the, even the more medieval inspired uh Dark Souls where you're not told what to do, you're not really told. There are only hints, and those hints are, of course, I think Elden Ring kind of monopolizes on this in a different way, but those hints kind of can culminate in a very fragmented narrative, but that's kind of it. Whereas, yeah, Dark Souls 3, I just don't think has that weirdness, right? There's less of a, which I think is, thinking about it from like a maybe whatever design or like a development or a business perspective is kind of a strange in itself, a weird thing for those developers to do, right? With a game like that. Like if they had made a game like Dark Souls that was even weirder, right? That would be uh I don't know, kind of amazing, right? Like I think it's hard to imagine that, but I think it would also be a worthy experiment for sure with how, the kind of legacy that the first game has.
It does occur to me now that the one place where I feel some of that, and maybe because it's the one weird place, and we could unpack why it's weird when it seems wholly typical, is the Ringed City. I said Ringed City like it's like like the Ring City or whatever. Um, have you all gotten there yet? I guess Shane, you're not quite there. You're in Anne Orlando, but Brian, you're in the Ringed City,
Yeah, it's in
right?
the DLC, right? So
And I will say, ever since the first time I played Dark Souls 3, the Ringed City really bothered me in a really rich way. I felt like I was in a dream. I've talked about my soul's dreams on this podcast before, but I'm actually going to say this is a weird thing that I'm just realizing now. I guess, sorry to repeat, weird, but my recent replay of Dark Souls 3 was actually inspired by memories of like a sense memory of the Ring City, and just a memory of like something feels wrong with this, and this it like this is like, again, it's so impressionistic, but there's something like sickly sweet about the Ringed City, and that it's so beautiful but also feels to me very unsettling, and that's quite supported by the lore, insofar as um the Ring City is literally like a poisoned gift. It's I think the story, which I now know because I talked the last time, Brian, that I've actually read, I followed the lore this time, but the I think the lore of the Ring City is that it was gifted by Gwyn to the pygmy race, um as a way of like kind of placating them and keeping them on the margins of his world. So the Ring City's like basically at the end of the earth, and it's this beautiful jungle, kind of like tropical ruin, literally a gilded golden city in a jungle, that it, was sealed their doom essentially. Uh, and maybe that's part of it. Like there's a kind of, I think on the one hand, sorry if I can just free associate here myself, like I think the idea of tropical melancholy is not a flavor you get in video games very much. So like I want to say the Ring City has a kind of like it's humid, it's incredibly humid and it's also mournful. And it strikes me now that I don't know of any other video game that is location that is humid but also mournful. You know, um, does that even make, is that nonsense to you guys, or does that track? Uh, I I actually I that's not a rhetorical question. I intend that as a real question. I'll just say one last thing here before I just abruptly break off. Um, it also strikes me now that the Ring City is a city of cathedrals inside of a swamp, i.e., it's like the quintessential Dark Souls location, and that those two things don't normally appear at the same time. So the cathedrals of Dark Souls, we might say, are quite arid, and the poison swamps, are sort of next to them or beneath them. But now we have literally like this city of spires that's sinking into a swamp. And that's a combination that appears, as far as I remember, nowhere else in all of the Souls games. Um, so it's something like, to return to the kind of impressionistic sense level, like the kind of like the heat and humidity of the Ring City environment, it just feels wrong to me. Like it feels like it's like this isn't how Dark Souls should be. Like and therefore it seems totally right as the final location in the series. Like that finally after all this time of like revisiting old places or getting riffs on just like the most archetypal video game environments imaginable, which is what Dark Souls 3 does. Like the catacombs in Dark Souls 3 are again like Crash Bandicoot level catacombs. They're almost laughable compared to like the weirdness of the catacombs in Dark Souls 1. Um, we get this place where again I did get that feeling of like, what am I supposed to feel? Am I supposed to feel, mournful and sad, or is that just my weird idiosyncratic subjective response to this environment? Is it because I'm remembering a dream that I had in childhood and not because of any intrinsic feature of this place? Um, like I would say that in my time, playing through the Ringed City, I'm just gonna stick with the Ringed City level. Like, I think I was pretty like unsure about what the emotional response was intended to be.
I haven't played. I played it a little bit, but it's funny that you remark so much on the swampy aspect of it because I remember it being pretty dusty. And that ash part to me was much more impactful, and sort of dropping huge distances was um weird to me. I do the there are certain parts of I think Dark Souls 3 that make me upset, but never in a way that like you're describing. Because I haven't played the DLC for this in a long time and I don't remember it very well, but that feeling you're talking about of incongruous environments actually maybe comes up. There is a castle surrounded by like a moat, and people are that's when people are coming out of the ground. And you have to fight them coming out of the ground. That's where to me it felt uh this like environments were uncontained or everything was new, that didn't really happen otherwise. It actually gets pretty like rote after that. You don't have um enemies that keep coming up. That was the first time in Dark Souls 3 where you realize, oh, I can't defeat everybody here because people just keep coming out of the ground. I liked how that there's like a formal break with what they expect of you. Um, but it gets kind of put away and you kind of dominate that area pretty quickly. And but that is also a place where you're not, this forked path of, um, you can go two directions for a very long time, and there is no real conclusion, or there's no like just defined boss area at the end. And I actually kind of miss that. Like I think I remember playing that part, and I was like, oh, like anything could really happen. Like this might be like the world is like kind of at like a fork, and I could actually explore like very deep one direction or deep another direction. I don't know if that was actually the case, but it did feel like I could just kind of keep if I could keep pushing in a direction and things were kind of unfolding in a new way. But yeah, that kind of got quashed after I left the area, and it becomes the catacombs, and it becomes, very pathed. Um, so yeah, that feeling you're talking about, it doesn't really come up for me other places in the game of not being sure how to feel, or it's like upsetting in a way I'm not understanding. I definitely felt just frustrated and upset towards the beginning of the game. What's the town called where there's like guys with scythes?
Undead Settlement.
That really made me upset. I was just very not happy. I felt wronged in a way. I'm kind of prone to this earlier in the games where I feel underpowered and kind of annoyed at people dropping from the ceiling. But it's not the feeling of being uncomfortable. or unsure of the environment. It's just very much like I don't like how you're what you're doing to me. But I do like the idea of music, especially when you mention the end of Dark Souls 1, that orchestral music that kind of comes. I like the quality of orchestral music in a game like this, especially where it's sort of sad, where you actually can't pin a lot of classical music down to like a feeling unless, you got your standards that like are absolutely, about a guy being sad as hell. But certain ambient orchestral arrangements are just like kind of I like when they refuse to be grand or refuse to be just sad, where it's just kind of like this like middle thing. And so you actually aren't being prompted to feel a certain way. I think, cheaply you could be like, "Oh, it's the orchestral music time and I'm supposed to like feel orchestral now." But it gets like any orchestral music in a game is going to get like reduced to that shitty feeling of it being like, oh, it's like the fancy part of the game. Um, but it does have it doesn't resolve for you, so you're not actually able to like shortcut the feeling. Um, and Dark Souls 3 retains its inscrutability in like boss difficulty, in just being like impenetrable for certain builds and putting you through like just a bad gamer time with boss run-ups and everything and no summons. So I think formally it does place me personally in like the that middle space sometimes, but I don't know. I think it's so distilled in like what you were saying in that Dark Souls 1 boss fight with the strange music, where music is supposed to usually in a movie or something, put you in a specific place, be like, this is the sad part. But to not do that, but still have really booming music is, I don't know, secret third thing.
Yeah, yeah. And Shane, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a non sequitur, but as you were talking just now, I put my finger on maybe something else to sorry to jump back to the Ring City, but about why I think partly because I mean just your discussion of like the aridity of or the dryness of the DLC, which is totally true. You begin the DLC in the Dreadkeep, which is just like a it's like a amusement park of dust where you're like doing these like plunges off these cliffs into like soft like powdered sugar like dust, ash and just kind of like navigating this weird, totally nonsensical artificial world of dust and ruin, but then you get transported to this city at the end of the world. And I think maybe what's incongruous is precisely that it's teeming with life, that humidity feels, you know um just dense with organisms and flourishing in a way that is, I think, again, like off the top of my head, utterly atypical for Souls games, including Bloodborne. I mean, even their swamps are dead. It's like the swamp is more to kind of give like a rudimentary and preliminary sort of like ecology of the Souls world. Like I feel like the swamps are swamps insofar as they're like dead, marshy ruin, the ruins of nature, whereas they're not the kind of swamps, or the way that we often understand swamps, I'm thinking to go back to our original Philly lore here, like, like John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, which is like a bunch of sewage runoff breeding like a kind of, relatively speaking, like a rainforest level of biodiversity for Philadelphia, Um, and and yeah, like I get the sense in the Ring City that it's this place at the very end of the world where like all life and hope have been abandoned, and yet it's weirdly dense with plants, you know? And like what other place in Dark Souls and Souls and Elden Ring even is dense with plants? Like that kind of life doesn't exist. Um, and even going back to this aesthetic category that I kind of proposed of like what was it, like the kind of like humid melancholia or something, or the like melancholic humidity. I'm just like just kind of in the sort of hi history of like whatever literature or art. Like I think you can have people, I mean, there's a whole kind of Oriental sort of the Orientalist tradition, which maybe is related here, of course, here in by a Japanese studio, but of where like a Westerner travels to the Orient and feels alienated and sad, like is in the jungle, but that's not, I don't think that's what this is. And I think in many cases, or then you have like White Lotus or something. So I'm really just free associating here, but like, you were like people go to the tropics and they feel like shitty about their lives or something. Um, but that, it's something much more unsettling and like existential than that, like where this, because I think maybe because you're not framed necessarily as a visitor, it's not about being a tourist, that the melancholy or the feeling of yeah, of melancholy is more. I want to say it. There's like there's an attunement between the melancholy of the player and the space, rather than it arising from a dissonance between the feeling of the player and the space. It's not like, oh, I'm in this beautiful place, but I feel sad. It's something more complicated and less familiar.
Yeah, this is maybe redeeming the game a little bit for me in certain ways because I think like ending in this, as you say, tropical melancholy place. I think one of the things that works about it is that there are places in the other games where there's plants and stuff, but they're plant enemies. So here it's like the plants are just are there, right? They're just existing and you can't interact with them. And they're not there for you, whether negatively or positively, right? They're just kind of these indifferent things that are, they're part of the landscape, but I think, importantly, they're more than just part of the landscape too, right? Nothing in these games is just landscape, I think. Um, it's also making me think that, like the drag heap then maybe should have been, I'm saying should have in the predictable, like if we were playing it by the book or something, that maybe should have been the final area, right? So to have something after, and I feel like we've talked about this with Bloodborne a little bit, right? The fishing village area feels like a kind of strange, totally incongruous area where where is that placed in relation to the ending or the end of this world, right? So the end of the world you would think is just dusty ruins, right? That's kind of what I would picture. Um, but the good thing that it's not is that, how do you represent the end of the world or a city at the end of the world? I mean, I don't think it's with tropical melancholy, but I also don't think it's dusty ruins, right? There's no way to actually represent it. One more thing about melancholy, though, I'm thinking, this idea of melancholy in a place that's beautiful, I think there's another way other than just I'm in a beautiful place, but I'm sad. I think there's also an I'm in a beautiful place and then therefore I'm sad or therefore my melancholy is amplified, right? I mean, there's a sense in which speaking of melancholy or whatever, times I can think about it, it's times where things continue to go on around you, and that's precisely why the melancholy is like so, fatal or whatever it is, right? Or
Hmm.
so dangerous or so pervasive, is that there are things happening around you that again, it's almost like uh I don't know if either of you guys identify with this, but it's like when you feel melancholy, sometimes the worst thing is to listen to happy music or something like that, right? Like it's going to make you feel
Mm.
worse, right? And so, so there's an indifference that is almost the flip of the weird indifference that we've been talking about, right? Like the indifference of the world in Bloodborne is an indifference that feels really bad or feels like scary. This is why the Lovecraftian thing applies. It's a terrifying indifference. Whereas the indifference that you can come into contact with from within melancholy is like a positive indifference in a way, right? But it's negatively felt by you because you're melancholy, right? It's not this
Mm.
like neutral indifference of the world that doesn't care about you. It's this indifference of the world that's like doing its thing and kind of still going about what it's doing, right? And so I don't know. I think that if I mean, not that the Ringed City is a positive place. It's a very difficult, frustrating place with these weird, kind of scary guys with what looks like a burnt out sun all over them, as their mascot. Um, but I think if Plant you're still allowed to be melancholy there. If there were plant enemies attacking you, I think the melancholy would dissipate. You would be something
Hmm.
else would happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Brian, you've blown my mind twice over here because first of all, the comparison is totally right that Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 have set sort of tee it off with these, environments that feel like climactic, like
Mm,
even to the point of in Dark Souls 3, and Shane, maybe you remember this, like when you are on route to the final boss of the base game, you get this view of like the world turn like kind of put into a blender where like everything is like warped and these cities have become like it's literally just like a blended world where time space has become like circular and weird, and doesn't make sense anymore. And the idea is that like all of the kind of Dark Souls cosmos is being drawn into this sort of vortex and losing its reality. And then it's a tease because it's literally like a bonfire. You see that view, that skybox, and then you like walk like 20 feet and then you're at the final boss. You don't actually get to explore that space. It's just like a moment of presentation, right, from the designers. And then in the Ring City at the Dread Keep level, like you actually get to explore that space. And it feels like that should be the end. Even to the point, Brian, I'm not sure if you realize this, but when you fight those twin princes, or sorry, the twin demons,
mhm.
I had to find this out on Reddit, but if you look around that arena, actually, you'll see that it is literally the remnants of the Firelink Shrine arena from Dark
Hmm.
Souls 1. So, like that church structure is right there. That's what you walk through to get to the transport to the Ring City. So
Right.
it's like, what could be a more appropriate ending to the series than to fight these demons in the original Firelink Shrine, right? And similarly, Bloodborne ends with you have the nightmare version of already a nightmarish place, and then you ascend the tower. It's like video game shorthand for like final boss, right? You like go all the way up the tower, then you fight this person. Um, but in both cases, there's like this remainder that the game has not in any way set you up for. And that feels literally excessive. Like it doesn't even belong, And I think when we talked about the fishing hamlet, I described it as like the place where the game dies and goes to heaven,
Yeah.
And I would say that that's true of the Ring City, for similar reasons, because it's incongruously beautiful and peaceful, in a game that's full of like misery and blood. But I would say the Ring City feels like dying and going to the heaven of a god that you've never heard of before and totally unknown. It's like some other god's heaven.
Mm.
And I think I just as I say that I want to sort of yeah put my like put a stake in it. Like that's for me that is the feeling of the Ring City is like you're suddenly in another god's heaven, or another game's heaven.
There's a yeah, this is so interesting. There's a concept in cleaning up the ocean where I guess there's heaps of trash in the ocean where new life has learned to like feed off plastic and thrive in a way, and cleaning up would actually kind of destroy this new environment. And I think of the Ringed City, and I think Dark Souls 3. What I haven't really given it credit for is it priming you with a certain experience and then giving you another one after it. And the contrast is kind of the most interesting part. Um, Tangent, but the idea of this plastic world that you're not supposed to disturb, and yet being so profoundly depressed by it because, if only the people that lived here could understand how horribly bad I personally disapprove of this vision of reality. Like that we were at the end before, and this is like you said, like a different god is in charge now and is running the plastic empire. And if you took close-up photos of these plastic bioluminescent plankton, it would be like the most beautiful little world of like orange and green and Legos and little amoebas eating them. And yet like to have my experience growing up as a person who sees pollution as a bad thing, I see it as such a deep, um, the end of Planet of the Apes. Like you ruined it, you blew it. I can't believe what you've done with this world. Like this new beautiful thing in a very cropped image is such a, depressing and deeply sad thing. For there to be life teeming in a place that was supposed to be the end is like worse.
Mm, mm. I love that. Should we end there?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to sign off with the universe's moral indifference to our anthropocentric, worldviews or whatever.
Cool. All right. Well, gentlemen, I
That
have,
was great.
yeah, thanks again, Shane, for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.